Alright, so today, as part of my alternate history series, we have Alternate History Hub's What If Pearl Harbor Was Never Attacked by Japan? This would be a very interesting scenario because it makes it suddenly much more difficult for FDR to justify the Americans going into the World War II, which FDR really wanted to do, but the rest of the government really didn't want to do, and the people were kind of iffy on the matter. So, it really was Pearl Harbor that brings America into the war. So if it doesn't happen, it's kind of a big deal. America's probably still going to get involved in the war, but it's not really sure how. So I'll be interested to see what his take is on this. Now, like with any of the alternate history videos, I will be assessing not only the plausibility of the divergence point. So whatever is different that causes the event not to happen, I will be looking at that and seeing how plausible it was, if it was likely, if it was unlikely, if there was any real basis of reality to it, or if it's just kind of a fun thought experiment. I'll also be judging on whether or not I agree with his outcome, whether or not I agree with what he thinks the world is going to look like. Now, we'll never actually know what would have happened, but we can sort of take guesses based on what really happened and by other historical things that went on. So, and by taking a look at countries' histories, so we can really kind of gauge more or less what would have happened based on a lot of things. So let's dive right in.
This video was sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online service where you have access to a huge catalog of tutorials that give lessons on skills in multiple different fields. If this piques your interest, they're offering a free trial for the first 700 who click down below. You can find out more at the end of this video.
British brains, American brawn, and Russian blood won the war. When Stalin initially said those words, he spoke of the industrial might of the Americans. Guns, tanks, planes, ships. In World War II, the United States was a military production machine. An engine. Every engine needs that initial spark to awaken it. More importantly, something to fuel it. That spark for America was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. That fuel was the urge for revenge. There's a reason the 20th century for America can be divided before Pearl Harbor and after. Before, the United States was an island. The public didn't want to give any more in the fight against the Axis other than weapons and supplies. That was, until the war came to them. The sneak attack on Pearl Harbor was the perfect combination to enrage an entire country. In the span of one day, isolationism became a thing of the past. So how would World War II have continued if Pearl Harbor was never attacked? Let's imagine one possible alternate timeline. It is December 7th, 1941. Everything is simply calm. And that's because Emperor Hirohito, a man with a weak hold on his militaristic generals, actually enforced his will. Japan will not carry out a sneak attack on the US. From this point on, the relationship between the two countries is tense, but never goes past that. They're separated by the largest ocean on Earth, and without some instigation, it stays like that. For some reason, out of FDR's control, the United States never enforces an oil embargo on Japan. Instead, he remains in Washington, frustrated that the Americans have to sit out the war. Britain is on the edge of a Nazi Europe, and the Soviets have been invaded. The public, however, doesn't want to send their men off to die like they did in the Great War. Only 8% supported a war against Germany. Congress would never vote for such a thing, and it stays that way. With no war between Japan and America, Hitler never blunders into declaring war on the US. FDR can never send over troops, as none of the public wants to get involved. By December 7th, 1941, the Japanese have been fighting another enemy on the frozen coasts of eastern Siberia. Japan is at war with the Russians. Both the United States and Soviets posed a threat to Japan. However, Japan chose to go to war with only one. With no embargo, the US isn't that target. With Germany invading the Soviets from the west, the Japanese saw it as a good opportunity to seize the less defended Siberian coast. With such a long distance, it'd be difficult to reinforce it as well, so they carried out an invasion of the USSR. For the last few months, the Japanese have been fighting a harsh war against the defending Russians. To compensate for their lack of armor, they chemical bombed cities dotting the border, killing hundreds of thousands to lighten up defenses. Throughout 1942, their advancement, just like their German counterpart, begins to stall. The war was won with Russian blood, and the Soviets, with their vast manpower, still push back Germany. In Europe, without the Americans, D-Day cannot happen. Not like it did in our time.
Now right here, it's quick to note that when winter set in after the Germans had invaded Russia, Stalin wasn't sure whether or not to bring Siberian troops in at first. However, Stalin somehow had allies in Japan. Oh, not allies, I'm sorry. They had spies in Japan who assured him that Japan was not going to attack him. By this point, it was clear that the Japanese were going to attack the United States. That's what the spies thought, that they were going to go after the Pacific Islands and possibly attack the United States, which Stalin was all for, but it was clear that they were not going to invade the Soviets. That's what the spies assured him. And Stalin, being as paranoid as he is, that would have taken a lot to assure him of this. It would have taken a lot more than just hearsay or something. It would have taken a lot. Stalin was an extremely paranoid individual. But anyway, so when the winter set in, the Russians were already good at winter fighting because it's Russia. That's where they grew up. That's where they trained. They are used to the cold, and Russia specifically designs their armies to be able to fight in the cold. Like, they train their men for it. But the Siberian Corps was especially trained to fight in the brutal, horrific cold of Siberian winter. So when he learns that Japan is definitely not going to attack him, he takes the troops out of Siberia. Not all of them, because, again, paranoid, but many of them. He takes them to fight the Germans, and these men are extremely effective at fighting the Germans, or forcing them to push back in the middle of Russian winter, and it inflicts a lot of German casualties very early on, right through the winter. So not only the elements, killing German soldiers because they are not equipped to deal with the cold, but now the Russians are effectively fighting them in the cold. They have effective and trained men who specifically are trained to fight in the cold. That is what they do. And a lot of the men are also from Siberia. They are from that region, so they are adapted to the cold. They grew up in it. So that was a huge factor in this. Now, I still agree with what he just said, where the Russians still would have pushed back the Germans. It was going to happen, but it probably would have been a little later or a little slower, or both, because he would have had to be fighting on both sides, and he would have had to bring up that Siberian Corps. So I don't know how well he would have been. Stalin would have been able to really effectively fight the Nazis off in the winter. He may have had to wait for the spring. He definitely could have attacked them, but it would not have been as effective. So it's just an interesting bit of information there, that if Japan had attacked Siberia, as Stalin believed that they were going to for quite a while, then it would have affected the war on the side of the Germans. Probably not enough to actually cause the Germans to win, but definitely enough to probably slow the Russians down, prolong the war, and be in the Germans' favor.
Line. Eventually, Berlin would have to fall to the Russians, and more troops would be sacrificed to defend the Eastern Front, even if that means leaving France and other occupied territories open. The Nazis didn't believe in retreat, especially for Germany. With a drastically smaller enemy, only now could a D-Day-like invasion occur, involving a smaller force of British and Canadians. Even if the wait was a few months, the Soviets are able to invade further west in this timeline, seizing all of Germany and Eastern Europe in the process. Germany isn't divided between East and West in this alternate world. All of Germany is simply communist. Meanwhile, in the East, the Japanese can't hold back the Soviets, as more reinforcements arrive after the fall of Germany. Japan now is facing the full might of the USSR. Instead of their empire falling piece by piece thanks to American island hopping in the Pacific, Japan might face an actual worse fate. Stalin was quite vengeful. The Japanese teamed up with Hitler, caring little for the lives of his own troops. Such a bloody, devastating invasion could be very possible. The Japanese face an actual invasion for the first time in history, and by the end, they are virtually obliterated as a society. Stalin helps them rebuild, but sets up a puppet communist government. To America, who has sat out of the war, all they witness is the new rise of Soviet global dominance. In Europe, only Britain, France, and perhaps the Scandinavian countries remain democratic. All of East Asia has fallen to communism as well. It is in this moment, the end of World War II, with a Soviet victory, where the concept of isolationism begins to end. To the public, staying out of the war brought nothing but glory for the Reds. The United States is in a world where its ideals are more alone than ever. Perhaps this is the spark that awakens the American machine. Not a machine for war, but a machine to prepare for what many assume will be the next fight. If the Japanese Empire lost the war at home, then perhaps its large navy and territory could have remained. But now that territory is just in the hands of a Soviet puppet state. Because of this new world, a mentality, much like in our own timeline, could arise. To protect themselves, the West would need a special type of weapon. One that was conceived years back but never truly tested. Perhaps it might even things out in the inevitable next conflict. World War III, the nuclear bomb. However, this is simply one scenario. We'll never truly know what would have happened had things gone differently. But it's always a fun idea to think about these things, how history happens, and the world that we live in today because of it. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
So yeah, with any instance of World War II, there is a million things going on at once. There are many, many factors that go into everything that happens. And everything is connected. Now, in this particular scenario, in which the United States never enters the war, I do agree that the Russians would have pretty much taken all of Europe, outside of the Benelux countries and France. Italy may have escaped, but Italy would have been on the side of the Axis. I mean, unless the British were able to pull off an invasion of Italy, really that's not unlikely, actually. if if the Germans are weakened enough trying to fight the Soviets, then they may have been able to pull one off, especially since the Italians were pretty inept at warfare, and if the Germans aren't there to help them, then they're not really going to be too effective, not against the British. Now, they don't really have the numbers that they have in our timeline, which the Americans and the British both invade, but they certainly would be able to pull something off. So you may see a divided Italy. If they manage to pull it off, you may see an Italy that gets split the way that Germany was split, except over north and south, with a communist north and a democratic south. You may see some sort of neutral thing happen, where Italy's sort of left to be on its own. Although one of the two ideologies, probably communism, would end up taking over. If it were neutral, it would have enforced itself onto them. But this scenario kind of plays a little bit similar to, at least in Europe, it plays a little bit similar to a previous video I did, what if D-Day had failed, in which the Soviets really just end up getting more of the glory of the war. They end up taking over a lot more of Europe, and they get a lot more out of it. Now the difference between those scenarios and that scenario and this scenario is that Asia is a very different story. Had the United States been in the war, but the Soviets only focused on Europe because of D-Day, then we probably wouldn't have seen the rise of a communist China. But because the Soviets then turned their attention onto Asia, we're going to see a communist Asia. We are going to see a communist China, and it is interesting to think about the Soviets invading Japan. However, the Soviets are definitely going to push them out of Manchuria. There's no doubt there. The Japanese army is not going to stand up to the Soviet army. There's no way. If the Germans couldn't do it, the Japanese absolutely can't do it. They don't even have the manpower the Germans had, and the Germans couldn't muster it. So they will definitely push out of Manchuria. They'll be pushed out of China. They'll be pushed out of Korea. Now, the Soviets don't really have a very strong navy. The Japanese do, and naval power goes a long way in making sure you don't get invaded. An aerial invasion through paratroopers probably would have the most likely scenario, but with limited technology available for aerial attacks, I think this would have taken a long time to pull off. They would have had to hit very specific regions, try to spread out, and they try to then open up supply lines in which they can get troops from the mainland onto Japan. But they would have to get past the Japanese. I can see the Japanese basically setting up a blockade in which nothing gets past mainland Asia onto Japan. I see the Soviets having a very, very hard time invading Japan. I can't call whether or not it would have happened. I think the Soviets would have tried desperately to do so, but they don't have the navy to do it. Yes, they do have the industrial capacity to make an aerial invasion possible, but aerial invasions are so much more limited and so much more risky that if Japan were smart and they knew the Soviets were coming and they weren't going to win, if they could have pulled their army out of Manchuria, just given it up, and fortify the home islands. And if they had done that, I don't really see the Soviets being able to take them out. I don't see it. Only because the Soviets just have a hard time getting there. You may more likely end up seeing a treaty between the two in which Japan gives up all of its mainland Asian territory to the Soviets, and probably some of the islands to the north. But I don't know if an invasion's really likely. It's a tough one, because the Soviets definitely would have tried. there's no doubt Stalin would have tried. Now the Soviets were not working on an atomic bomb, so that's not a thing. That's not going to come into it as a factor. Soviets would have gained technological research from capturing Germany. That would have given them insight to the potential of a nuclear bomb, and it would have given insight into potential for rockets and jet technology, but that would have taken time to develop, probably a couple years at least. So there could have been a stalemate. You may have seen sort of a Cold War between the two. I think the Soviets would have absolutely tried to invade Japan. I don't know if they would have. It's really hard to invade an island that has a very, very large and powerful navy when you don't have one. By the time America dropped the atomic bombs, they were planning to invade, but by the time they got there, not only did they control the islands just south of Japan, but the Japanese navy had been absolutely destroyed. Their air force had been destroyed, and their army was trapped in Manchuria. In this scenario, we're most likely going to see the Japanese army withdrawn into Japan. The air force is still going to be strained by the Russian Air Force. There's no doubt about that. But the Japanese plane's Zero was a better plane. It was a better fighter, and it would have been able to hold off a Russian assault in the air pretty well for a while. Eventually they would just start to run out of planes and then run out of pilots. They don't have the industrial capacity to start replacing things near the rate the Soviets do. And they don't have the manpower to start replacing men either, so eventually the Soviets can wear down the Air Force, and that's when they drop the aerial invasion. But it would have been a long war. It would have been a long thing. I think it would have taken a year or two before they could even attempt to pull off an aerial invasion. And if they do, then there's a question of getting more men and supplies and tanks and all of that they're going to need, that they're really going to need to take out the Japanese. Getting that past their blockade is going to be very tough, and the Russians are going to muster what kind of navy they can and try to break holes or something. I don't really know, but the Russians don't have a very strong navy at this point. They are a land power, so to try to go after a sea power, I don't know. As far as the divergence point goes, Hirohito just asserting his will, not very likely. They kind of ignored the guy. He really had no control over his military. They were going to do whatever they wanted. Some other factor had to play into Pearl Harbor not happening, but for Hirohito to simply just be like, no, we're not going to do it, and they say, okay, highly unlikely. I think Pearl Harbor, once the military decided to do it, it was going to happen regardless of what Hirohito decided to do. His decisions didn't hold a lot of weight with the military. So Pearl Harbor was probably going to happen. Now let's say that it doesn't. Let's say that that scenario does happen and Pearl Harbor never happens. Even maybe for another reason it never happens. But the Americans did not get into the war. FDR wasn't stupid. Not by a long shot. He was a very, very intelligent man. He could even be pretty devious when he wanted to be. We remember him as this great president, this great hero, but he definitely had a little bit of a devious mind in terms of strategy. He did a lot of things, in World War II that were a little underhanded, but were very effective. Nothing really horrible. There were some horrible things. Those things like the internment camps, but overall, we're not saying he's a horrible person, but he definitely put some underhanded moves against the Axis forces, and he definitely had a devious mind for things. I think he may have found a way. To provoke Germany. Hitler was becoming increasingly unstable as the war in Russia was becoming more of a failure, and they were being pushed back. With Hitler becoming more unstable, I think it would be easier just to piss him off. I think it would be a similar scenario to the way the Franco-Prussian War breaks out, in which Bismarck sort of just keeps manipulating communications and letting certain things slip into the hands of French spies in order to provoke the French emperor to attacking Germany, and then they just go and destroy them. I think the same kind of thing would happen. You would have seen intentional intelligence, false intelligence being given to German spies or double agents, and trying to provoke Hitler into a war. Make it look like America was going to enter the war, but if Hitler were to do such and such a thing, if maybe he declares war first, then he can prevent America. Maybe America is going to send, all these supplies and troops over to Britain and surprise attack him, and then now he's going to use submarines to sink this fleet. And they end up just sinking supply ships. There's no troops. Doing something like that to sort of provoke Hitler into doing something. Or maybe Hitler just openly declares war. He was unstable. He was overconfident. To the last days of his life, the very last day he shot himself, he was overconfident. And he was not hard to provoke. FDR was a very intelligent man. He had a lot of very capable men around him, and I think that he could have pulled something off. I think America may have still entered the war without Pearl Harbor. It would have been a lot harder, and it would have been a lot later, but America was going to play a role in this war. But then again, that may mean a later entry, may mean no D-Day. It means the African campaign starts later. It may mean, a later entry of the Americans into invading Italy. It's really hard to say what would have happened. I don't see FDR just sitting on his hands and doing nothing. He may feel like his hands are tied, but FDR is a very intelligent man, and he does have the mind to think of something. Even his generals, they knew that everyone that was close to him in his inner circle really felt that a war was inevitable. America was going to be pulled into this war, one way or another. He was just sort of looking for a reason, and Pearl Harbor was obviously the perfect opportunity. And then Hitler declaring war on the United States, was just, it was a perfect scenario for FDR. But I think he still would have found a way. I still think he would have found a way. But overall, I don't think that this diversion points out that happened. The military didn't care what Hirohito thought, and they would have done whatever they wanted to do. And again, if somehow that doesn't happen, I think FDR would have found a way to get the Americans into it. Now, they probably would not have been as effective in the war, because they would have come in later, and it would have been much more unpopular. So he probably wouldn't be able to send as much force into it as he does. He probably can't go completely full force into this war, but I think America would still enter in some fashion. So overall, I think it's a very interesting thing to think about if Pearl Harbor had never been attacked. But is it likely? Not really. Would America stand out of the war regardless of this happening? Also doesn't seem likely. When it comes to the post-war Europe, yeah, I totally agree. The Stalin would have taken everything. Had Stalin was already reluctant to give the Allies half of Germany, or that portion of Germany, because he felt like he had done most of the work. But he was willing to work with the Allies. In this scenario, that doesn't happen. There's no way it doesn't happen. He takes more. Even the Americans do enter the war. They probably enter the war later, and they probably don't enter the war full force. You probably don't see a full D-Day like invasion. You may see a invasion. You'll probably see an invasion of Italy. I think you're going to see whether the Americans enter the war or not. But you'll probably see an invasion of Italy. You'll probably see an invasion of Greece, and you'll probably see some kind of invasion of France, because one, they want to get it out of German hands, and two, they want to make sure the Russians don't get their hands on it. So I think they would have definitely tried to go after France, and now Germany would be in a weakened state, so it'd be easier to pull off an invasion, but it would be less effective because the Soviets would be that much closer to winning the war. and so they would probably not get any of Germany. They might get bits and pieces that France wants, but that's about it. Overall, though, very interesting video, very interesting concept to think about. I definitely agree with a lot of things. There's a few things I'm kind of iffy on. The actual invasion of Japan by the Soviets, I definitely think they would have tried. I don't know if they would be able to pull it off. If they do pull it off, it's going to take a while. It's going to take a lot of manpower, a lot of resources, which Russia has. But the Japanese also have a warrior military culture. They are very effective at war. They are very effective at fighting. They would have made it very, very hard for the Russians. Their technology was very good. And, one thing that comes to mind, FDR didn't like the Japanese. He didn't like the Japanese government, and they were trying to expand in the areas, and even if they leave the Philippines alone, which they would have to, because they don't talk about hard thing with the Philippines, Americans still win a war. And by this point it would be Truman in office. By the time this war ends, FDR dies in 44, and there's no way that the war ends any sooner, so it would probably end in closer to 46 to 47, and then you're still looking at a war with Japan. If Truman sees Stalin suddenly take a huge chunk of Europe, he might be inclined to help the Japanese. I don't know how likely that is, but it's another thing to think about. What if the Americans were to say, well, we don't want Japan to follow communism as well, so maybe we can help them to underhandedly sort of like supply them, or maybe we can diplomatically end this. Stalin was probably not going to be on board with the diplomatic resolution, but he was still going to get Manchuria. He's still going to be able to get China. He's still going to get Korea. He's probably still grabbing a number of islands from Japan. I think he may have finally agreed to something. He did already grab a lot of Europe. He already had a lot of big wins. He may have actually just given up the war for a number of things. Japan would have been hit with reparations, things of that nature, but it probably would have saved Japan. I think the United States may have still entered in some way diplomatically into the war to try to end it before Japan also turns under Stalinist regime. But that's hard to say. It's really hard to say. World War II is one of the harder areas in modern history to talk about alternate history, because there's so many things that go into every decision. There's so many possible outcomes, and there's a lot of things that we just don't know. Because World War II follows such a narrative, and it was, like, as I said at the beginning of the video, there's a million things that go into a decision made in World War II. There's a million things that go into every decision, and there are many decisions. This is one of the largest scale wars in human history. So there's nothing small about World War II. There's nothing that you can say is insignificant. So, that being said, it is really, really hard to say whether or not any of this would have happened. What would have happened between Russia and Japan is very, very, very hard to say, except for the fact that they would have steamrolled into mainland Asia. The Soviets would have steamrolled in. But anywhere beyond that suddenly becomes very, very murky, because the scenario becomes very muddy, as I explained earlier. So, I'm going to go ahead and end the video there. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. If you have any other videos, whether it's alternative history or regular history, please put them in the comment section, and I will certainly check them out. And I will see you next time.